Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lucy Heffernan, and I'm here today to discuss the possibility of expansion into the Cuban market. I will be presenting the board with a pestle model analysis of the Cuban business environment in order to establish whether investment in the country represents a viable option for this firm. The aim of this presentation is to assess the macro-environmental factors that could affect this firm in the Cuban market. I'll do this by highlighting the threats and opportunities posed by Cuba's unique political, legal and economic environment. I will then explain how Cuba's cultural and ethical practices may impact on the firm's ability to do business. By the end of this presentation, the board should be equipped with enough information to make a decision on whether Cuba represents a viable business opportunity. Cuba is a communist country and is widely regarded by the rest of the world as a country without political freedom. In fact, in a recent 2015 Index of Economic Freedom, Cuba was ranked second most repressed country, being beaten to the top spot only by North Korea. Its overall score has risen year on year, however, reflecting the current government's attempts at policy reform and their recognition of the need for liberalisation, not only for the country's economic policies, but also for its people. One of the main reasons Cuba's overall economic freedom remains severely hampered is due to the incredible restrictions still placed on the private sector by the government. Obviously, in such a repressed environment, natural entrepreneurship also stagnates. However, it is worth noting that unlike many repressed countries, Cuba does not suffer from the same levels of social unrest and instability. In fact, Cuba is politically and socially very stable, a phenomenon that most sources attribute to the rapidly approaching retirement of the Castro dynasty and the widely held belief that once Raúl steps down in 2018, he will be replaced by a new wave of politicians who have no memory of the revolution and who will usher in a faster pace of reform and liberalisation. This impression is further reinforced by what seems to be the penultimate move by the US in the normalisation of trade with Cuba, and Obama's recent call on Congress to begin work on ending the embargo. Normalisation of trade between the two countries will give Cuba's economy a boost, not only allowing its exports to reach a much larger market, but also through the predicted increase in tourism on the island. Lifting the embargo is also set to improve Cuba's financial risk status with banks, reducing transaction costs and allowing better access to credit for those wishing to do business on the island. However, there is generally a belief held that when the embargo is lifted, there will be an influx of American firms, and if one truly wishes to be competitive and viable in Cuba, there is a need to get established before they arrive. Now let us move on to Cuba's legal environment. Firstly, it is important to note that only 3 forms of foreign investment are allowed in Cuba, these being international associated contracts, joint ventures, and totally foreign-owned companies. And whilst on paper foreign partners may hold a majority share in Cuban resources and supposedly have the freedom to hire and fire Cuban workers at their own discretion and fill management positions with workers from any nationality, in reality the level of freedom allowed by the Cuban government can be quite restrictive and is actually more down to ministerial whim than any actual policy. Similarly, whilst no taxes are paid on enterprises' gross incomes or on their shareholders' dividends, there is a dazzling array of little taxes and additional fees, for example labour tax, transport tax and fees for certain documents, that can technically be applied and that, if applied, would more than make up for the lack of income tax. So, whilst on paper Cuba may seem to have a legal system that strongly favours foreign enterprise, it is important to remember that there is actually no separation of political and legal systems, and that this means that inherently the systems are biased towards local firms, and can in reality place any additional obstacles in the path of foreign investors that get in the way of the government, all of which inevitably heightens the risk of doing business in Cuba. Now if we move on to Cuba's economic environment. As we can see from the graph, Cuba is running a constant trade deficit, and the government has a vested interest in promoting and encouraging forms of foreign investment that will look to reduce this deficit. However, with respect to trade policy, it is important to note that the government favours the development of local industry, and only in specific cases is the foreign investor allowed to access the local market, as the government does not wish private Cuban companies to compete with foreign firms. In regards to the close relationship between Venezuela and Cuba, the board must be aware of the potential for not only negative economic consequences for Cuba if the situation in Venezuela gets any worse, but also the fact that we run the risk of being cast in a negative light if we are seen to be closely linked to a government that so vocally backs a political system currently seen by the rest of the world as violating the basic human rights of its people. If we look at Cuba's GDP growth for the last 10 years, we can see that prior to 2008, the country was experiencing robust growth. However, two natural disasters in the latter part of the year ensured an economic slowdown. In 2012, the country was still said to be recovering from these disasters, and subsequently, the GDP growth seen since has been sluggish. However, it is still important to note that Cuba is ranked third in terms of real GDP growth for countries within the region. Only Panama and the Dominican Republic show higher levels of growth. Cuba's growth rates must also be considered in light of the lack of aid and other restrictive economic sanctions imposed on the country under the US embargo. It is therefore fair to say that once the embargo is lifted, GDP growth must surely rise. Whilst the embargo continues, Cubans make a great effort to survive on a dual economy, one in pesos and another in dollars. Wages are paid in pesos, and survival on wages alone is very difficult, with wages being the equivalent to 5 to 20 US dollars a month. Individual incomes, however, are often subsidized by unofficial payments in US dollars. This has had the effect of increasing the social standing of the traditionally less respected tourism jobs that come with the opportunity of earning tips over the more traditionally respected professions such as doctors. Wages are also subsidised by remittance from family members in many cases, meaning that disposable income levels are actually a lot higher for citizens in Cuba than one may first think, although it is very hard to get any verifiable statistics on the real level of disposable income for the country. The change in public perception and the desire to possess US dollars has also brought an increase in the attractiveness for working for foreign firms, implying that worker loyalty should be high. This fact is further reinforced by the government's unique method of combating unemployment. If a citizen remains unemployed for 2 years, they face the possibility of criminal conviction. Cuba's population is aging, and this could pose a problem for workforce acquisition in the future. However, Cuba's workforce is highly educated. Cuba actually has one of the highest rates of university graduation of anywhere in the world, and has a literacy rate of 99.8%. A better educated labour force implies an increase in potential for economic productivity for firms operating in the country. It also implies that if Cuba's private sector was allowed to fully flourish, the country is likely to possess a wealth of new ideas and innovations. Stable population growth and an absence of social violence and a high life expectancy all point towards a stable environment for investment. At this point, I think it's worth noting that unlike Korea and China, Cuba possesses a large service sector, and this, coupled with its aging population, makes the rapid development that has been seen in the previous two countries unlikely to be replicated. Also, whilst a lack of confidence in the state's ability to provide essential services could spur civil unrest, it also provides foreign firms with a definite competitive edge. Similarly, the high demand for foreign products and services that so far have been lacking from the Cuban consumer market represent a great opportunity for potential investors. However, decades of communist rule have left the population with little or no understanding of private property, and this could pose a threat to potential employers, as employees may have a tendency to steal. Finally, it is worth noting that Cuba has a surprisingly low level of corruption, and in fact it has the lowest of any country in the region. In some ways, the Cuban business environment is more similar to Australia's than other Latin American countries. Like us, Cuba is a low-context culture, and Cuban people tend to place more emphasis on punctuality than others in the region. Having said this, absenteeism and a lack of punctuality are rife. However, this is mainly due to serious public transport problems and fuel shortages. Like Australians, Cubans tend to be less formal, and this is best portrayed in their work outfits, which it is worth noting are more likely to be found replicated on Australian beaches than in our offices. However, this is mainly due to a lack of formal clothing being imported. Whilst openness to new ideas is valued, it is not yet a concept that has fully entrenched the Cuban business mind. Decisions are therefore usually handed from the top down, and this process may be found to be frustrating for foreign investors, especially if they do not wish to have a substantial ground presence. Business processes may be further frustrated by the need for most Cubans to establish a personal relationship with someone before they do business. Like most Latin American countries, Cuba's space orientation is much more public than our own, and they have a far more effective culture than we do. Now let us finally move on to the ethical issues posed by Cuban business. Some of the biggest ethical problems a firm investing in Cuba will face come from its environment. Cuba's natural environment is often described as an ecological paradise, and the country is home to numerous endangered species. However, anyone doing business on the island must be aware that Cuba faces considerable environmental problems when it comes to deforestation and the preservation of its wildlife. If the government does not put serious attention towards further environmental regulations in the future, rest assured that green groups operating in Australia and the rest of the world will make sure that any foreign firm that poses even a potential threat to Cuba's ecosystem comes under serious public scrutiny. Other ethical issues that a firm may face when doing business in Cuba have to do with Cuba's human rights records and its obvious repression of people's liberties and lack of freedom of speech that come from it being a communist country. However, the populist image of Che Guevara and Cuba's fight against the overbearing, oppressive wishes of its bigger neighbour have allowed Cuba to somewhat escape the negative image normally associated with a repressive regime. In fact, in light of the embargo, Cuba is generally regarded as somewhat of an underdog, and countries trading with Cuba tend to escape being accused of helping to prop up a repressive regime. So, should the board invest? Well, let's quickly recap. For starters, the government has very restrictive policies towards the private sector, and this inevitably stagnates innovation in the country. However, they do recognise the need for reform and liberalisation, which means that the situation can only improve. The embargo with the USA is also said to be lifting, which means that not only is the future expectation for GDP growth in the country pretty good, but also that there is a certain amount of time sensitivity for firms wishing to invest in the island, as there is a definite need to get there before the rest of America does. However, regardless of whether the embargo is lifted or not, there is still no separation between the legal and political systems of the country, making business law very unclear. There is also a complicated dual currency system to negotiate. However, the presence of this system does imply that worker loyalty to foreign firms will be strong. The labour force in the country is also smart, and there does seem to exist a big demand for foreign products. Cuba also has incredibly low levels of corruption compared to other nations in the region, and it's often seen as being more familiar culturally than other Latin American countries. However, it cannot be ignored that due to the existence of the communist regime, individuals in Cuba tend to have no concept of private property, and this could pose a definite threat to employers. It also must be mentioned that the large service sector in Cuba means that it is unlikely to replicate the boom seen in Korea and China. And finally, it is worth noting that whilst the economic sanctions imposed under the trade embargo are still in place, and whilst a member of the Castro dynasty remains head of state, the pace of liberalisation and reform that is needed in Cuba will remain incredibly slow, and this is only set to frustrate and severely hamper any foreign investor looking to enter the country. So, in conclusion, it is my view that the board should wait to invest in Cuba, as it is very unlikely that the normalisation of trade between Cuba and America will be a quick process. And until Raúl steps down in 2018, the liberalisation of Cuba will not be allowed to fully accelerate. So whilst Cuba is not yet a viable investment opportunity, if the liberalisation and reform process continues to progress as expected, it definitely represents an attractive option in the future. Thank you for your time and consideration.